बन बन भाई, स्टोरी सुना रहे भाई, कहानी सुना रहे हम। हाँ हाँ, वो उसमें स्लाइड में ही है। मैंने कहा फीलिंग आने दो। अभी भावना आएगी। स्लाइड्स रेडी है, स्लाइड्स रेडी है। अरे वही है, कुछ मॉडिफाई नहीं किया। वही चीज अपना वहां पर भी है। Okay, let's start our session first. So this session is all about a pen test which we did in the Azure, like kind of Azure Red Team or Azure pen test, you can say, and it was performed by me and my friend Chirag Savla. We both work in a same company, White Knight Labs, and this was a 3 weeks of a pen test where we were given a simple reader user over a intra ID and all the subscriptions. And our task was to do as much we can, and we did, and that's what we did. So we were able to compromise on-prem servers. We were able to become owners over 25 subscriptions, which is like 3,000 resources. We even become a global admin. We even had the access of DevOps as a contributor and a lot more stuff. So yeah, next slide. So my name is Donald Parmar. You can call me Double One, which was a DJ name of me because I used to be a DJ and a music producer for last 3 years. I've been a speaker at multiple conferences like that, or Nullcon, and a lot more conferences that are there. My area of interest is in Azure and AWS and applications like source code review, black box, white box, everything. And yeah, I'm been a OSWE, and that was my first ever certificate which I did while I don't even had any knowledge about what is security. So yeah, and this OSW I took when I was doing my internship, and one of my colleague is also there, Deepak. So we both worked at Security Brigade. So that was my starting of my career. This is the attack flow, the actual attack flow which we did, where we start from here, and we have like multiple kill chain where we end here, here, and here. So one is for Intune devices, one is for global admin and on-prem servers, like pivoting from cloud to on-prem, and then how we become a contributor over the Azure DevOps as well. So we'll have 4 different kill chains on how we perform these attacks. Next. Yeah, so the first attack is reader to owner. So just before I start, how many are aware about Azure environment? Like what are subscriptions, intra ID, you all guys are aware, okay. Next. So how it all started? So assume there's a company name XYZ, and we were given 2 different testers, one for Chirag, one for me, and it was a very basic user, just reader permissions, like you all have. If you are using Microsoft, you might have the same permissions within the int ID. And for subscriptions, we were given reader role over the root management group. So when I say root management group, by default, you get reader permissions or whatever permissions the client has attached for all the subscriptions at once. So yeah, our goal was to hunt or break as much we can do, and me and Chirag, we both divided our job by performing the innovation for intra ID and for subscriptions and some different stuff. Yeah. So we started with basic enumeration, understanding what the company is majorly using, like what kind of services they are majorly using. So we find out that they are more using some VMs, some data disks. So they had around 2000 of virtual machines, 5 to 600 of data disks, and all those are like 256 GB RAM servers, like huge. But we are not interested in this because as a reader user, you won't be able to get anything from the virtual machines or data disks or those servers. So in web application, every time we say like juicy data. Similarly, we have some juicy services like automation account, function apps, logic apps. Why? Reason is, if you as a reader user have permissions to read these services or resource, you can read source code of their resource. Like for example, automation accounts has something called as runbooks. So these runbooks are basically the scripts similar to what you know about function apps like Lambda. So these have those scripts, and as a reader user, I can read those scripts as well. So what if the developer has hard coded any credentials, any service principals, any refresh tokens, anything? Next, we have function apps. Okay, I think this is the old slide. Chirag, I think. Okay, we had some modification in this slide, but yeah. So function app is not there. There's another service called as Data Factory. After some update after 2021, I guess, Azure has removed the permission of reader user to read the source code of function apps because they found out that this is kind of vulnerable. So because they have removed that. But there's another service called as Data Factory. So Data Factories again has a lot of pipelines, global parameters, which can be read by a reader user as well. And the last one is the Logic apps. Logic app is again kind of like a function app, but in this case, you don't have to write any code. It's just a graphical stuff which you can just create. For example, let's say I want to do something like if any email has been received with attachment, automatically some actions will be triggered. For example, sending the attachment to my storage account or some another function app or maybe Cosmos DB. So all those things will be done without doing any coding. And yeah, that's all we needed. Why? Because these allows a reader user to read internal data. Update wala. Okay, we'll update the slide and show it again. Another is something called as ARM templates. Now the capability of ARM templates is bit similar to what you have seen in Terraform. It's like bit similar, but the difference is that Terraform supports all the clouds, but ARM only supports its own baby. So in this case, what I can do is, as a developer, I can write 100 of resources which I need to create. I can attach all the roles which I need to do, and at just one click, I can create 100 of resources, all the source code, all the deployments, everything at once. So what if while doing this automation, developer hard codes any credentials again? Like for example, we were creating a CTF where we added this thing. So the thing is, let's say you need to create 100 of VMs, and all those VMs need to have, let's say, any EDR needs to be installed. So in that case, you can have something called a script within those VM, and you can write a code, and that will be like hard coded. So as a reader user, I can just directly read those templates, like it's like kind of a configurations, and I can see if there's any license key or service principal credentials or like that. Yeah, next. So yeah, currently there is not much tooling because if you see, there are tools available which can allow you to enumerate all the resources, all the permissions, everything. But what if I say, is there any tool which can allow you to read source code of hundreds of function apps? Source code, like function app has multiple functions. Is there any tool? No. So I had my own tool called as Vajra, which is kind of a private version, which allows me to read the runbooks, function app functions, logic apps code, everything at just one click. So I can just provide access tokens, service principals, or maybe username and password, and at just one click, I can list all the resources, all the permissions, all the internal data. For example, if the user has contributed permissions to the storage account, automatically my tool will go to the storage account and list all the files for me. I don't need to again and again go within those stuff. So with that, it helped us to do a lot of stuff. Next. So this is just a screenshot of one of my tools. So you can see I was able to list one logic app, and in that logic app we again have a lot of workflows, and that one workflow had such this kind of JSON where it says use the service principal to send a GET request and just get the data. So this is a logic where when I'm sending a GET request by attaching the service principals, there are again multiple ways of doing that, because if you see, this is the graph API of Microsoft. So you need to have some kind of authentication, right? So there are multiple ways you can use manage identity as well. In AWS, if I say, if you know about an SSRF attack where you can grant the access tokens. Similarly, in Azure, we also have which is called as managed identity. So I can use that as well. But this is again a critical one because you directly have the hard coded credentials. So we were able to find similar code in the actual assessment, and the funny part is that the developer was only trying to just get the data, but the permission attached to this service principal was admin. Like why? Next. So yeah, you can see when we checked for the permissions, which is like API permissions, you can see application dot read write all, which means that नहीं, बड़ा ही हो. So you can see there are more permissions like read dot all owned by, but these are useless. This is only one which is very useful because it again allows me to write the applications, not just this application but other application as well. It's similar to application admin permissions. So now we had the client secret and client ID as well. So we just logged in. Next. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. User. User. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So when you have a GUI format, you also have a JSON format as well, JSON workflow. So if you go to JSON workflow, you will get this data only. It's the JSON which is getting rendered by the Azure side in a graphical way. Yeah, yeah. Yes, yes. That's what I said. There's another way called is manage identity. So I can use manage identity, and the token will be granted from the Logic App server. So as a attacker, I won't be able to get any data. Yeah, like the permissions will be managed by the IAM. This hard coded one? Hmm. No, no, not identity storage. So if you go to Logic app, back. So if you go to Logic apps, so it's the portal is this portal is similar to what you see in the Azure portal. So if you go to Logic app, you will see one option called as workflows, and within that workflows, as a developer, I can create multiple workflows, and that's what it is. So right now, I do only have the JSON format, but in the portal, you will see graphical format, and if you just see that, you will be seeing the hard coded credentials, and that's normal. Like this is how it is. No, no, there are multiple ways. You can use manage identity. So rather than using this, I can just have something called as manage identity. And Logic App will know that, okay, I need to provide authentication, not from service principal, but from my own server. So if it use the metadata API calls to get the authorization token and use that for the request. Yeah, Deepak was saying something. Enterprise apps. Okay. Now, okay. Next. So yeah, now we have a permission which can be considered as a shadow admin. A lot of you guys know about shadow admin, right? Why I'm saying shadow admin? Why? Because as I said, it has a permission to add client secret to any application. So what if I find any application which has global admin permissions? I can just directly update the client secret and get access to it. But we didn't found any kind of global admin permissions. But we did found one app which again had an application administrator privilege. So, picture, मेरे को पढ़ने दे यार. नहीं मेरे को बैक करना पड़ेगा इसमें. Okay, so there are two things. Here you can see there are API permissions and another is the IAM one, roles and administrators. So when I say API, it means that you can have very dedicated permissions, because if you see, if I create a new user, by default it will have the reader permissions in the enter ID. But for app registrations, again you have two things: API permissions. Now within this API, again you have different types. One is the application, another one is the delegated. So if you know, whenever you click any login page like login with Microsoft, you see something like provide access, read permissions. So that's called as delegated permissions, which means this application is taking permissions from the third user and using that permissions for himself. It's different. Yeah. Yeah. And whenever the user will accept it, this application will get added in the user's enterprise apps, because it's like the user has granted the permissions on his behalf. Another is application where this application himself has the certain permissions. So again, there's a difference. So yeah, again, you have dedicated permissions. So because of that, you can just log in and just get the permission. But whereas in delegated, you need to have access to the user's enterprise app, like the victims. Only then you will be able to use those permissions. So yeah, this time this application permissions, but here what we found is the application administrator, which is the roles and admins, the normal IAM which we use. So it's a bit similar to what you see here, application at read write all. Okay, so we used our first app to add client secret in the second app, which had admin permissions, and now we have the privileges within the intra ID to manage all the applications. It can be your app registrations, it can be your enterprise app. I can delete the apps, I can add client secret, I can add even permissions as well. So that's all we had. And there's another tool called as road recon, which again allowed us to enumerate all the permissions of the enterprise app. So we found another app which has this permission, which says group.readwrite.all, which means that I can use this application to add my tester user to any group. So what if I found any group which has again global admin permissions? So hoping that I will get access. First one was failed. Let's see for second time. So we found this third application which has group.readwrite all permissions, and we quickly just added a new client secret within that application, and we logged in with that group.readwrite one permissions, which is the third application. So this was a great win for us. So all what we need to find is a group which has very high permissions, but what we observed is in intra ID, when any group has any admin permissions, it is a privileged group. And if I only have the group.readwrite permissions, I won't be able to add any user in this privileged group, because you need admin permissions to add any user in that admin type of group. So again, we were failed. We did have some groups which has a global admin permissions, but we were not able to add ourselves within that group. So we again continued our enumeration, and this time we started to enumerate the subscriptions, not the entire ID, but the subscriptions. And while doing that, we found one service principal. Again, the service principal is similar to what I said, applications. So we found a contributor role permissions over one service principal, and that specific resource group again has a lot of function apps, which is Lambda. And because I have the contributor role, I can directly read the source code of those function apps. I can create new function apps. I can grant the manage identity and a lot of things. So we found one function app through which we were able, like through which we were found that that function app is using something called as hybrid connections. Now when I say hybrid connections, it means that there is an on-prem server, and that on-prem server is being connected with the cloud service. It can be your function app, it can be your automation account, and only this resource is capable of accessing this on-prem server. So now, but again, this is second attack part, so we will continue in the next one, but do remember this part. So we started enumerating again, and this time we found one group which had the owner permission over the management group. So the issue was that till now we were trying to enumerate within the subscriptions, within the intra ID, and we were not able to find. But when we tried to enumerate within the management group, we found this one group which had the owner permissions, and luckily it didn't had any admin permissions within the intra ID. So again, roles are different in intra ID and the subscriptions. It's completely divided. So it only has owner permissions within the subscriptions, which doesn't makes a privileged group. And when we added our user in this group, guess what? We became reader to owner over all these subscriptions. So we had access to all the thousands of VMs, data disk, function apps, automation accounts, like everything. We are the owner. We can just delete all the resources. So, so here we are right now. So I'll just give a quick recap. We went to the subscriptions. We found one logic app. Within that logic app, we found one workflow, the JSON one. Within that, we found one application which has app read-write.all permissions, through which we compromise application admin app, and through which we again compromise the group.read, which is the enterprise app. Okay, again, it's all service principle, but the terminology is different. It's the app registrations, and this is the enterprise apps. And through this enterprise app, because I had the group read-write permissions, I added this user in this group, and through which I automatically got the access to over all these subscriptions. Any questions till now for this attack path? Okay.
Just one thing to add, the enterprise app that we found where we had group information, enterprise app was the third-party application used for doing backups and migration from on-prem to cloud. So that app was like a third-party service, cloud-based service that we can use,
Yeah.
which had high privilege.
So I think it's like someone from this attacker has given the rules. Yeah. So it's like the user of this tenant has logged into some application, like log in with this application and provide these permissions. So he might has done that, and that another application, third party, got added within this tenant, and this way we were able to compromise it. So now another is the reader to AED connect execution. Who is this? Okay, no problem. So going forward now, yeah, so we have this another function app. As I told you, we had that kind of attack part where we were able to compromise one service principal, which has a contributor role over a resource group. So we found one function app, and when we went to the network stuff, we found out that it was using hybrid connections, and within that we found one on-prem server. So we know that this function app has the capability of accessing some on-prem server. And additionally, while we were going to this one, we like before going to this part, we found this code. It's quite similar to what we found actually in the real world. So this code says invoke command and doing some PS remoting to stuff. So we had a question like how this is this the function app is accessing the on-prem server. So we had this question, and when we since we had the contributor role, right? So we were able to get the values of these environment variables, which is like the host name and the credential stuff and everything. We tried to connect it from the host system, but it didn't work. And then we find out that there is something called as hybrid connection, which is again it was the first time for us as well. And then we find out that okay, this is something I need to use from the function app. So we quickly created a new function and just tested it out if it's working or not. But there's another good part which is called as publish profile. Now uh, I can say this function app has another portal which is called as SCM portal. This SCM portal is kind of a admin management kind of portal which allows the admin to directly interact with the shell. Like it's kind of a cloud shell that you have for that specific function app. So this again called as publish profile. So this publish profile has the credentials of the FTP which is enabled for this particular function app. So I can use the FTP credentials to directly access it. So here you can see this is the function app, and if I just download this, I will get something a file like this, and within this I have the username and the user password, which is the FTP credentials of the SCM portal of that specific function app. Again, I think by default it's enabled or basic auth is, yeah, basic auth is there. So by default basic auth is enabled. So whenever you want to access the SCM portal, you can just click on the like there's a navigation bar like advanced tool. So it will directly use your OAuth credentials and give you the permissions. But what if you don't have those permissions? You can directly use the basic auth credentials by adding this basic auth in the URL, and you will be prompted with the username and password, and you can just directly push the credentials, and that's it. So this is how it looks like. So when you have the access, you can see we have a debug console here and some environment settings. You can view some app settings as well and all the stuff. So again, this is using something called as kudu service, which allows you to interact with the server of the function app, where you can use the shell, like you can run the commands as a PowerShell or maybe a bash. Kudu is a, yeah, I think it's Azure, right?
It's an application which is used for managing app services and So is it an Azure application or third party?
I think
It's
it's a
an
Azure
Azure
one.
application, but it is like a third party service that they use. Okay, for doing it is open source on GitHub. You can just go and search for Kudu project and you find
Yeah. So again, using SCM portal, we can execute system commands over PS remoting. Again, it depends what configuration is done in the on-prem, what ports has been opened. So since the PS remoting port was open, so we were able to use some commands to directly interact with the on-prem server from the function app. So admin credentials of the server was stored within the key vault, but since we had the permissions, we can directly. I was able to directly like we were able to directly use the permissions to extract the secrets from the key vault. And yeah, the admin credentials were also reused on others on-prem. So there were, I think, 2 or 3 on-prem servers, and same credentials were being used on those servers. And we also find one more thing, that this key vault has more credentials, and those credentials are actually been using for the application proxy. Now, application proxy is another component of Intra ID which allows you to interact with your on-prem applications, web applications, publicly. So you have an internal URL and you have an external URL. So there's a exe which you need to install within your on-prem server, and then you will be getting your external URL, and you can just directly use. So let's say if I want to share my application, local applications to my friend, I can directly abuse this feature to share my friend, like just provide the URL and he can able to use my on-prem applications. So yeah, this is how the portal, the same portal looks like, where you can directly run the commands. So we had the credentials and we directly created run this command like invoke command, and in the script tag, and you can see in the script tag we again have an invoke command, like invoke and the invoke. And within that, because there were 2 virtual machines being used, so we went to one virtual on-prem server, and from that on-prem server we connected to another on-prem server which had something called as AAD connect installed. So AAD connect, or you can say intra AD connect. So what it does is it helps you to synchronize your on-prem users on-prem data to cloud. So for example, if there is any on-prem user has their password got reset, automatically that will get updated in the cloud as well, and same credentials can be used to log into cloud as well. So it's kind of synced, even there are groups and users and there are more data which actually gets synced. So yeah, this is just a simple understanding. Like this is the intra ID, this is your on-prem, and that's your Microsoft Intra Connect, or you can say Azure AD Connect, which is like changed. You have your Active Directory, you have your connectors, and it's getting synced. You know, so again, this is a very deep topic, which it will take like 1 day or 2 day to cover, but just for a basic understanding for now.
I'm going to give a glimpse in my talk on this. This is how
Yeah,
actually do.
yeah. Do you want to talk about this? Because yeah, we can do this part. We can do.
So ideally, there are when you use Entra ID Connect, it is like a hybrid connection which allows hybrid identity-based configuration in Azure, which allows you to sync your on-prem users group to cloud, right? Which means now you can use same user credentials across on-prem application servers and in cloud. It can be Azure portal, it can be any other third-party applications which are integrated directly with your Entra ID. So what happens is when you actually use Entra ID Connect Sync, there are 2 variants. This is the old variant, which is Entra ID Connect Sync, but still used across multiple enterprises. And there is a new configuration that is also known as Entra ID Cloud Sync. Okay. But what we found was in this application, in this scenario, we found Entra ID Connect Sync was used. And when you see this configuration, ideally in this configuration, there are 2 users that are created. One user that is created on-prem, that is in your Active Directory instance, and the second user that is created in your cloud instance. Now, the user who is created in the on-prem Active Directory, that needs privileges to sync the credentials, which means that user has to have privileges to extract those credentials from Active. So there is something known as DC sync if you're not familiar with Active Directory based attack, right? So what happens is this MSL underscore account, the star is basically an alphanumeric value, random identifier for your Android Connect. Initial 20 characters or 12 characters are added there. Okay. This particular user has replication all privileges, which means now this user can perform these things on the Active Directory, sync all those users and credentials and send that back to cloud. The best part is this user is also excluded from identity based services, identity protection based services, like example MDI, Microsoft Defender for Identity, because it has to continuously perform that attack. So now if you own these credentials and you do DCC, MDI is going to be silenced when you're bypassing logging or alerting. Second thing is the sync underscore star account. That is basically an account that gets created in your cloud instance, that is your Entra ID. And this particular account has privilege that is directly synchronization account privileges. The best part is now from your Entra ID, the passwords and users are same, but there has to be a user on cloud that has to write those user credentials, password, and everything, right? Modify user properties. And that is what this particular user has the privileges to, right? So another thing is the user credentials for both these users are actually stored in a SQL instance on the same server. So it depends how you configure your Entra ID Connect, right? It can be on the same server or it can be on a different server. Other best part is the credentials are encrypted using BP API in background. So which means if you have system level privileges on Entra ID, AD Connect machines, you can actually connect to that MS SQL instance and decrypt those credentials. But we had some challenges here. There was some EDR installed. I'm not going to name that since that has been recorded. Okay. But maybe offline. So there was an EDR installed. So what we did was we started with this particular script. We modified the script. The script was created by Adam Chester, also known as XPN on Twitter and multiple social media platforms. But the script has a limitation that you can only extract the MSL underscore star account credentials, right? So that was only a limit that could allow us to do a desysing on on-prem. On-prem was not in our scope. We wanted to escalate to global ID. So our target was to get the sync user credential. What we did, we actually there's another tool also known as AD internals, if you have not heard of. One of the best tools for again offensive Azure related stuff or Entra ID related stuff. So we modified or we pulled some source code contained from that particular tool. We modified this basic script in a way that would also bypass EDR. We splitted that script into multiple parts and then we stored that script on the disk as a normal file, imported that during a call with some codes. You can see that we are calling some additional functions like function extract, and then we are initially we got that MSL underscore credentials. And if we go on the next slide, after modifying, we actually executed some scripts here directly on this particular PS remoting session, and then again we loaded or executed a different function which actually helped us in extracting the sync account credentials. So here you will see that we managed to get the actual credentials, which is again in clear text for sync account, and which indeed allowed us to gain access to a portal, as well as we had privileges to reset any user credentials that are synced from on-prem to cloud. Prior to 2021, there was also a possibility that you could reset the cloud only user account credentials. When you mean cloud only, which means user accounts that are only created or accessible in Azure environment, right? So that would have allowed us to ideally get GA or easily, but you can see there is an error now. But this was patched by Microsoft. But now you can only reset the credentials of sync users. So now you need to be lucky in case that there is a sync user which has higher privileges in Entra ID. That could be like global ID. We had those privileges, but again, client did not give us an approval to reset that particular user credentials because that was used in multiple automations and other stuff. So this is where we managed to get global ID.
Okay, so next, this was the second kill chain. Third one is the reader to Intune admin. So Intune is again okay. So yeah, Intune is again a service within the Azure, which is within the Intra ID, which allows you to manage your employees' devices. It can be your cell phones, mobiles, your Windows machines, Mac OS, or Linux, and everything. So again, it has a lot of capabilities as well. Capabilities like as an admin, I can manage which applications need to be installed within which devices. I can even run commands within the Windows machines, Mac OS, and everything from the Intune itself. So that's what we're going to talk about in this. So back to Logic app, where we were able to find this application which has application.read-write.all permissions. And again, from enumerating the tool, we again found some another application which has a contributor role over a specific resource group, and that resource group again has some more resources like automation accounts. And because we had a contributor role, we are able to create new scripts, which is like kind of a run books, which allows me to execute the run books. I can read the jobs, like the output of those scripts and everything. So within the automation account, I found one called as credentials, which is kind of a configurations. So it's something like you can create a credential, store it, but you can't read the credentials again. It's like creating a new password. But who is able to read these credentials? Only the run books. So these run books have the capabilities because that's the workflow, right? So because I had the contributor role, I were able to create something script like this. I just mentioned the name of those runbooks, and that's it. Once I executed this runbook, I was able to, yeah, this is just a PowerShell command to which I imported the runbook and started the job. And if you see in the output of the job, I was able to see all the values. And again, this had a lot of credentials for your VMs, for your application proxies. So application proxies credentials, like there was some admin portal, I don't remember, it's like an identity platform which was installed within the on-prem server. We were able to log into that application as well, but again, it was kind of useless. So yeah. No, that's the workflow, because if let's say you want to do some automation, right? And let's say automation says authenticate with these service principles, get the token, and run some API calls. So in that case, you can't hardcore stuff, right? So in that case, you can have your environment variables. You can use this one. So it's kind of like that. So again, we also found another user which has at Intune admin permissions, and we tried to log in. It says configure the MFA. Like we were asking, it's been asked for by us that you need to configure the MFA. But we had a lot of issues again, like because of conditional access policy, because of Intune policy as well, and all some device compliance issue as well. Like three issues, we were not able to do it. So there's one issue called as device compliance, which we actually tried to fake by using AD internals. So AD internals allows me to change the version of the device and all the stuff and make it looks like a compliant device within the Azure. So we try to do that. We try to bypass the conditional access policy as well, but due to Intune policy, we were not able to log in. So, yeah, Chirag, would you like to? Like this is the AD internal tools which we are trying to use.
So
Yeah.
basically, what we did was in AD internal, there is a capabilities where you can add devices, virtual devices. There has to be there is not a necessity to have a physical device or actual VM to be added on that particular machine. So using an approach that is firstly requested and device code, we use device code authentication to request an access token, which would allow us to add any device. In Enter ID, by default, any user can join a device to Enter ID. Okay, that is a by default configuration. But the best part is it can be modified. If you're a security guy or on defense side, you can modify it to selected users or group. So what we tried to add a device, and then we tried to modify the compliant status of that particular device by modifying certain configurations on the Intune side. But we had a very good policy on the client end, that is the Indian policy, which had like I think 5 or 6 rules that has to be made sure that this all configurations are made on that particular live device, the actual device. Only then this particular device can be marked as compliant. So that this was like one of our failed attempts where we tried to bypass those controls, bypass those policies, but again at the Indian policy level, we failed. So you can see our device was added in that particular target tenant, but we could not pick the MDM status, right, which is stating as none. Otherwise, if we would have managed to get that as compliant, we would have bypassed that MFA requirement, set an MFA for that. for that particular user, and then use that and gain access to entire engine environment.
So yeah, so as I said, I had a reader permissions as well. So as a reader permissions, I have the access to read the data of Intune as well. So we logged into the Intune portal, which is like intune.microsoft.com, and as a reader user, you have the capability to read the data. As I told that as a admin, I can execute the commands within the Windows, Mac OS, and Linux server, right? Luckily, we found some scripts hard-coded which had the EDR license key. Should we reveal the name of the EDR? It's a known one. It's a known one. So yeah. So again, we even found the local administrator credentials which we can use to log into the on-prem servers. And yeah, so again, yeah, this is just a Mac device. I think Windows doesn't allow us to read the scripts. Only Linux and
scripts cannot be read directly from the portal.
yeah,
But if you have privileges, you can still fetch those scripts.
yeah,
Okay.
download it, right?
Linux or Bash based scripts you can actually view on the portal, and this is the law.
Yeah, I think it's only for your Mac OS and your Linux only. Yeah, for the Windows you can't read the files. So yeah, this was the key right here. I guess this was this of the EDR. That this is the actual screenshot of the assessment. So again, we were able to compromise till this part. If we, but we tried to play around this stuff, but yeah, it was again a failed attempt. Another kill chain, I think this is the last one, which is a reader to DevOps contributor. So we'll talk about how this flow works. So Azure AD DevOps again works very differently from Intra ID. It has its own roles and administrators and everything. Another fun part is, let's say I am a basic user. I created and I have the permissions of DevOps as well by default. I can create a new organization, new projects, everything. But even if there's a global admin, he cannot see if anyone has its own DevOps. Like I don't know why Microsoft doesn't have this capability, but yeah. So we asked, like we didn't found any way to compromise the DevOps. We did found the DevOps name from the from the app service, app settings, and something like that. But it was using some access tokens, managed identity stuff, and because of which the client even didn't allow us to go through the app service because it has some network restrictions as well. So we asked our client that please provide us the reader permissions over your specific DevOps projects and all. So yeah, we started performing enumeration and all. So in DevOps, there's something called as project settings, and within the project settings, if you go to permissions, I can list all the members, all the groups, all the service principals which has the permissions. So we found one group which is this AD group. So when I say AD, which means it's the actual group within the intra ID. I can create a group within the DevOps which works differently, and this is a group within the intra ID. So if you remember, I have the permissions group.read at all. So we directly just added a user within this specific group. You can see this command, and now we have permissions to write the files within the DevOps. So we had the permissions to modify all the thousands and not thousands, it's more than that actually. Yeah, so it was having tons and tons of files, and we were able to compromise these credentials like DevOps PAT, database connection strings, service principals, intra-ID username, password, API keys, email credentials, actual Gmail, if I say, and external service credentials as well, like hundreds of credentials, I would say.
We gotten credentials of one of the applications that they were using for some financial
Yeah.
payments.
So yeah, this was fun. So this was all the attack flow which I talked about. Now there's a very big failed attempt, I would say, not from our side, from the client side, because he didn't got fished. It's from the client side. The victim never opened that specific stuff. So I'll talk about this. So there's something called as Cloud Shell, if you guys know Cloud Shell. So again, Cloud Shell of Azure and AWS works differently. In Azure, you have storage account connected to your Cloud Shell, but after this attack being known, Microsoft didn't remove that feature, but added a new feature where you can select if you want a storage account or not. So we found out that there was some cloud shells and has some storage account. So whenever you create a cloud shell, by default you have a storage account name starts with, like the file shell name starts with CS. CS means cloud shell. So there's a .img file, which is your file disk, you can say, which is being stored within this file disk. Yeah, this is the name of the storage account. And because I was the owner of all the 3000 plus resources, I was able to download this file. Again, this is a screenshot of my own account. So there's a ACC Azure. So Azure is your basically going to be your username, like it's Ronak, so there will be Ronak. So we downloaded this file within our Linux machine because the file format was ext2, which is again for the Linux only and not for Windows. So when we downloaded it and mounted to our on-prem servers, we found out these files where we have .azure. When I say .a, when A is small, it's for Azure CLI, and the A is big, it's for Azure PowerShell module. So it's like PowerShell module and API and Azure CLI is different, but it didn't have any credentials. So when these files are created, whenever you run AZ login, these files will get created and has all the refresh tokens, access tokens, and all the configurations. So what is the way through which we can access this? See, I have a .img file which is mounted within the Cloud Shell. I ask you what you can do. And by default, whenever I open this Cloud Shell will already been logged in with my own account. And I have the credentials stored uh, a second, within this folders, which is .azure folder within the Cloud Shell. And I have the access of .img file and I have downloaded it in my on-prem. What you can do? Yeah, I've already updated it. I know. But what more you can do? I'll ask how. How you can seal it? No, but give me the technical word. Like how you will do the attack. What malicious script you will write through which you can steal the token. No, no. How you can steal the token or okay, forget about the token. What I'm saying is here in the Cloud Shell you will be pre-logged in. You don't need to run Azure login, Azure Connect AZ account. You're pre-logged in. What you can do to like what malicious activity rather than stealing the token you can do, and assuming that this user who has logged in is a global admin. It's pre-logged in with AZCLI and PowerShell modules, and you have the bash RC functionality to which you can run the commands. What commands can you run? Steal token is fine, but
How do you steal that?
no, it doesn't have any hard-coded access token. It's kind of empty plate. But okay, just forget about for the because I'm going to show that. Forget about stealing the token. What command you can run, which is very simple. What I'm saying is you are pre-logged in here. What command can you run as an attacker? Okay, let's say I give you this access, okay, this portal, and you have the cloud shell of the global admin. What you can do here? Huh? Exactly. You can run simple command, add permission of global admin to me. AZ AD add permission, that's it. Why need to steal the token? You can add yourself as a global admin. So yeah, that was one way. But what we did was we updated this .img file. We added these two files, bash rc and this. I hope everyone knows about this file. Whenever you open a cloud shell, a PowerShell, any code written within this file will get executed, and same for the bash. So we created these files, unmounted it, uploaded back to the storage account, and we had this code. So in the bash, we written zip the file of .azure, and there should be no output. Again, there's a URL which says upload.php, and that's it. That's the curl command. So .php file is a very simple one that you can find just right how to upload HTML file for uploading, and that simple code I've used, and that's it. And so that was the idea for the PowerShell and the bash. So we assume that whenever the user will open his Cloud Shell, this command will execute it and we will get .zip file within our local system, but he never opened it. And why we targeted that specific user? Because we were looking through all the logs and seeing which user is actively using the Cloud Shell. And that user was using like once in a week, and we had like 3 weeks of the timeline to perform this pen test, and he never used the Cloud Shell. So yeah, again, just a simple recap. We had the file share. We downloaded the multiple IMG files on the local system, modified it, and uploaded back to the file share, like replacing the file, and assuming that this will happen, but this never happened. So yeah, this was the last one, and these are a couple of reference links. This one is the pivoting from Microsoft Cloud to on-prem, about the function app which I talked about. Second one is abusing logic apps. So in this we showed how you can use logic, how you can abuse the logic app to make it work like a function app. So if let's say you have a permission of storage account, how you can use storage account contributor role to directly access the logic app and get within the server of the logic app, and whatever permissions that specific logic app has, you might have that as well. And the last one is the exploring dark side of function app, sorry, package files. So again, how you can use package files or function apps within the storage account to compromise the function apps and create multiple functions and compromise it again. And yeah, any questions now? So we had like 4 attack fill chains and 1 failed attempts. Okay. Hmm. Yeah. It's a local one.
You are not aware of it's like a service from Microsoft that allows you to endpoints
हाँ
or
कर दे कर दे
applications on endpoints.
आप कर हाँ हाँ कर दे
So in this talk, we are going to look at what all the approach that you can use for integrating your on-prem environments or any other cloud environments with Azure or Entra ID, right? So this talk is all about how you actually leverage those integrations for your own benefit. Like if you're an attacker, how you could use that to move laterally from cloud to on-prem and from on-prem to cloud, right? We are going to discuss multiple such approach, right? A short intro about myself. My name is Chirag Savla. I work at White Knight Labs as a senior cloud security engineer. You can find me on Twitter, Google, Twitter, GitHub, anywhere with the name Exploit Coder. Okay, I also blog with the name exploitcoder.blogspot.com. I've created multiple open source tools. Few of them are like process injection toolkit, which uses C sharp for doing process injection and remote processes and stuff. I've also created a tool named Calidus, which is almost a POC tool created almost 4.5 years back. This was presented at NalCon 2020, where this tool actually uses Graph APIs for doing C2 communications, like a Microsoft Teams, Outlook, OneNote. So even if you are using mobiles, you can control a machine just via chat, right? A team message, and it would execute that command on that target machine. Um, my interest areas are into Active Directory, Azure, and usually into pen test and post exploitation related techniques in general. I've trained multiple peoples at Black Hat USA, beside Milano, multiple other conferences like well, there was Wild West Hack conferences last year, HackSpaceCon this year, and probably many more in coming years, right? Also speaker at multiple international conferences and meetups, like one of them is NullMeet THM. This is the first meet for me. Second, my partner for this particular talk. Note that this talk was actually presented at DEF CON Red Team Village. So we both presented this particular talk at DEF CON, right? So the first technique that we are going to discuss is pivoting from cloud to on-prem, right? So what are the ways by which you can pivot from cloud? So what are the services which could allow you to integrate your on-prem servers? When I mean on-prem servers, note that it could be a cloud instance hosted in some other cloud environment, or even in Azure environment also, maybe a different tenant. First service that we are going to discuss is Azure Arc. Anyone who knows about Azure Arc? Anyone who has used Azure Arc? I hope there is a time so we can do a to and flow type of session. I'm not sure about GCP much. Yeah. Anything else? So basically, an Azure Arc is a service which is designed by Microsoft, which allows you to manage your endpoints. It could be Windows, Mac, it could be any other services like a SQL service, Postgres service, or any other services. Okay. So what is the benefit is now you have a single portal to manage everything, right? So even if you want to manage your on-prem servers, you use Azure portal. Even if you want to manage your services like your VMware, your database services and everything, you use Azure portal directly, and you can manage all those services, right? So what happens is this service is will allow you to install an agent on that particular device. Okay, that agent has certain capabilities, right? So when you actually install any agent on a device, that agent would usually run with anti-authority privileges, because it is allowing you to perform multiple actions, right? Managing a device is like you need topmost privilege. So that is what the privilege the agent would have, right? So an agent is installed on the servers, which you can then manage that particular agent using Azure PowerShell, Easy CLI, Azure Portal, or REST API based calls and everything. You can configure your agent, that is your Azure Arc environment, to allow or block certain extensions. We are going to discuss about extensions later on, like what are VM extensions and stuff, right? You can also use custom extensions. So Azure has a functionality for virtual machines, which is also applicable for Azure Arc based devices, where you can deploy custom extensions. When I mean custom extensions, you can actually add a custom script extension which will allow you to execute any scripts on those devices. It could be PowerShell, it could be Bash scripts, or anything else. There's also a thing which is not on the slide, that is VM applications. I'm not sure if you have ever heard about VM applications on Azure VMs. So again, a VM application is like you can upload a specific application which can be executed on a target machine if you have privileges to do that. It could be a very simple application like creating a normal user, adding that to a local administrative group or something like that, right? Just to escalate your privileges. You can onboard a device with a simple script on an Azure Arc environment. It could be a PowerShell script, it could be a Bash script, depending on the type of machine. You can also use REST APIs to onboard that, right? Basically, the scripts would install an agent. By default, when you enable or integrate any machine with Azure Arc, manage identity is a service which will get enabled on that target machine, right? Which means now that machine can authenticate to Azure environment so that they can perform all those actions, right? Because now device has to send some logs, some notifications or some data to Azure so that it can say that that device is alive, right? It is active. So managed identity is enabled. If you look at the script, this is a simple script which would allow you to simply run this on a Windows machine and get integrated with your Azure Arc environment. Now, if you look at this code, you'll see that there is a PowerShell script that is getting run. Okay, but that particular script is actually installing an agent. Okay, and then agent, that particular agent is getting configured, and once that is configured, it can be viewed on your portal. So if you run that script, you'll see an output somewhat similar, right? Now assume that you're doing a pen test, right? You want to maintain a persistence. Can this be useful? How? What is the thought process? How will you use that? Like what all things you will do? It depends if you are monitoring the traffic, yes. How do you deploy or use this as a persistent technique if you are doing a pen test? Very simple answer. Maybe, may not be. What if you don't have access to the client Azure environment? No. I'm talking, can you use this technique to maintain persistence on a machine, okay, which you have an access to execute and command with privileged user? No idea. What if I tell you you spin up your own Azure tenant, add a subscription, create the script, add that device to your tenant rather than adding that to the client environment? Now you can execute the commands whenever you want on that device from your tenant. You control that. Yes, from the Microsoft portal, binary signed with Microsoft, created by Microsoft, and using for your own profit. Right. So once you actually integrate any machine with Azure Arc, this is the Azure Arc console or the portal view how you will see. Okay. And you can see here we have something known as machines, Kubernetes cluster, Azure Stack, VM, where vCenter, and many other services which you could integrate with Azure Arc. Right. So again, if your machine is integrated with Azure Arc, there are two ways by which currently you can gain command execution. Ideally, three ways, but that could be considered under Azure Arc extensions. Okay. So one is using Azure Arc extensions. One that we discuss about custom script extensions that you could use. Second is run command. So in Azure VMs, there is a feature known as run command, which allows you to execute commands on a target machine with NT authority privileges, which means you are like topmost user. If it is Windows, if it is Linux, it would be a root user level of privileges, right? So basically, if you're using extension, there is a custom script extension that you can use, deploy on that target Azure machine, whichever you control, right? You should have privileges to write that extension on that machine. If you have the privileges, you can write that extension and then give command execution on that machine. It could be a script execution or depending on whatever specific command you would like to execute. Note that the same feature is also available in Azure VMs. So if you're trying to compromise Azure virtual machines, then you can use same features. If you try to use custom script extension from portal, you'll actually have to upload the script on a storage account and specify the path and other things here. But what if you're using command lines? Yeah, Azure PowerShell, Easy CLI, REST API. This is a simple screenshot where you can see that I've used a command new-easy connected machine extension. This command is actually installing an extension with the name somewhere RTV demo or something. Okay. Yeah, RTV demo. The name is RTV demo, and the command that you see, the command to execute is cmd.exe/hostem.exe, which means that whenever this particular extension is executed and installed, it is going to run that particular command, and I'm going to get the output. Right. Again, this command runs with NT authority privilege. So you already are an admin on that machine, right? Second, as I told you, you can also use run command feature to execute command, which is you can directly pass that the source script and you can execute multiple commands or script anything depending on what is your target and get the output. Second service that we are going to discuss is automation account. Anyone who knows about automation account can give me some details. No. mm, Partially. Anyone? So basically, an automation account is a service in Azure which allows you to perform automated tasks. It can be a PowerShell based run that is ideally known as runbooks, okay, or a Python based runbooks which can allow you to perform tasks, automated tasks. It could be anything, deploying a resource, configuring a machine, or doing any other activity that you can do with PowerShell or Python. Okay, this service ideally allows you to add packages. You can use or leverage any packages that are there present in PS Gallery or upload your own packages if you are using a custom package. So which means indeed you can configure any machine, any service, you can do any automation using automation accounts. Okay. When I mean automation, it could be also automation that is like using Azure, you're spinning up an entire AWS environment. All those is also possible from automation account, right? You can think of about an automation and all those automation could be done. So if you look at this high level overview, you can see that this can be connected with multiple services. One, it allows you to manage your configurations of your devices, inventory, and everything. It can be integrated with multiple other services like your Azure Arc, Azure Alert, Recovery, Power Automation, Logic Apps, Event Grid, Monitoring, Power Apps, and many other things. You can also use for update management. When I mean update management, you can use automation accounts to push updates, patches on your devices, which could be integrated with automation account, right? And there are multiple shared capabilities that automation account has, like credentials, your certificates, and everything can be stored in an automation account, which your runbooks can be used, can leverage them to use that for maybe authentication, maybe some other activities like variables, credentials, connection strings, and many other things you have. Even you have packages, right? PowerShell packages, Python packages, you can use them. PowerShell modules, okay. So automation account again uses PowerShell or Python based runbooks, okay. That is basically the runtime that is available in automation account. So any automations that you can do with PowerShell or Python, you can use them in automation account. It also supports managed identity, which means no need to store hard-coded credentials. You can enable managed identity on your automation account and leverage runbooks to use managed identity and perform those actions, right? So you don't need to store any credentials in credential objects or connection strings or anything like that, right? But again, managed identity will only allow you to do stuff on your Azure environment, not on your third-party cloud environment. If you're using third-party cloud environments, you'll have to use shared objects like your credential objects and stuff, right? But again, those are limited that you can only access those objects or retrieve the data from the runbook. You cannot view that on the port, right? It also allows you to leverage DSC. If you're not sure what is DSC, it is basically a utility which allows you to configure your machines, automate your management of your machine, and configure your machines, right? One of the simple script that you can see, this is how you can create your runbook, and your simple runbook code can be like this. It is simply trying to request an access token from the automation account managed identity, okay. So again, automation accounts by default execute our code from runbook, which means you need a runbook in that particular automation account to execute your code. Now, to execute your code, there are two ways in automation account. One, that is Azure Sandbox. Note that I'm discussing multiple things which may or may not be on the slide. Okay. So one is Azure Sandbox, which means that your code will only execute on your Azure Sandbox. There is a second approach that you can use is hybrid workers. This is again another agent which gets installed on the on-prem machine, which allows you to execute all your automation workflows on one machine or 10 different machines again, right? Because automation account can also manage the configuration, manage the updates, and every other thing, right? So you can use hybrid worker agents to deploy or do mass deployment of applications, configure some settings or anything like that. Again, when you have to install automation account hybrid worker agent, okay, initially like a few years back, I think 1 or 2 years back, there was an explicit agent that you could use directly to integrate that. But since last 1.5 year back, they migrated this configuration. So now you have to actually use Azure Arc, and then uh, so basically an agent get installed with an Azure Arc extension on that particular on that particular machine, okay. And that is how you can integrate your automation account with that target machine, which means ideally Azure Arc is one of the priority service or the middle layer which automation account is also using now. Most of the Azure services, they are migrating wherever it is an integration that is done on on-prem machines or any other cloud environments. They are migrating the agents to use Azure Arc and extending the capabilities of Azure Arc with those features, right? Again, runbooks execute with highest privileges, which means if you are running your code on Linux machine, it would execute with root privileges. If you are running your code on Windows machine, it would execute with anti-authoritative privileges, right? So you can see there are multiple machines here in my hybrid worker group in this particular screenshot that you can see, right? So you can have one hybrid worker group or 10 different hybrid worker groups in a single automation account. Each hybrid worker group can have 10 different machines, or maybe all that 10 different machines are added to one or two hybrid worker group. It depends, right? So once we have appropriate privileges on the automation account, when I mean appropriate privileges, it is basically privileges to run the runbook, create a runbook, Those type of privileges or modify a runbook, this type of privileges would actually allow you to perform or execute your malicious code on the target on-prem machines, right? It can be simple like in reverse shell execution. So if you look at this particular diagram, let's assume you are an attacker on a service principal, which has some privileges on an automation account, right? An automation account, there are runbooks, multiple runbooks, which are integrated with this hybrid worker groups that are present. Okay. Now, if you look at this screenshot, this let's assume this all are on-prem machines. There's one group where there are two machines. There is one group where there is only one machine, right? It entirely depends on how you configure it. Now, you want to make sure that your runbook executes only on this group two. That is something that you can configure, right? Which means any code that is present in your runbook will get executed on your machine that is in group 2. It can be same machine in both the groups, right? Then comes the third service, that is Azure DevOps. Anyone who can give me a glimpse of what is Azure DevOps? Anything else? I think there is something there on the screen also. No? No idea? Anyone who has used GitHub extensively? GitHub in general. उसका actual utilization, automations, GitHub actions, and multiple things, right? So somewhat similar. It is an Azure environment. Azure DevOps is somewhat similar like GitHub, okay, wherein you can host your repos. You can have all your source codes deployed in Azure DevOps environment, all your source code, and this DevOps environment can be integrated with multiple other services. Let's assume you have a repo which is integrated with your app service or a function app, and is pushed to your Azure DevOps. There can be a cycle that could be configured that it has to be first deployed in staging environment, do XYZ testing. Once it is successful, you deploy in prod. Again, depends on how you configure your Azure DevOps environment, right? So again, there is a very cool thing in Azure DevOps that is a self-hosted agent. Okay, Azure has two types of agent. One is on Azure environment, that is an isolated environment, right? And then second is self-hosted agent, which means the agent is hosted on a machine that you configure or you own or you control. It could be on-prem, it could be on any other cloud environments, depends. Any virtual machines or physical machines, right? So what is in DevOps? Ideally, Azure DevOps has something also known as pipelines, right? Which allows you to do automation, like example, your GitHub actions and stuff, right? So in two different ways we can use or leverage pipelines to perform our automation or execute our tasks that we want to do. It could be Microsoft hosted agent, which is again hosted in an isolated environment controlled and owned by Microsoft, and second is self-hosted agent. For us, self-hosted agent is something which is interesting because it is supported on all these OSs or architecture like Windows, Linux, Mac OS, and Docker environment, which means now let's assume you have compromise in DevOps environment where you manage to compromise one of the repo where you have privileges to modify the pipelines and do multiple other things, right? In this case, what would happen is if you manage to modify the pipelines, you can modify a pipeline to execute any code. Now, if that machine has any additional credentials, you can extract that and move laterally on-prem or in whatever XYZ region that particular machine is, right? So again, with appropriate privileges in Azure DevOps environment, you could leverage the self-hosted agent to compromise and perform multiple actions, right? Just a high-level overview how this agent communicates. Okay, again, signed by Microsoft, communicating with Microsoft Azure environment, so no issues with your whitelisting and all those part, right? So by default, your agent would be somewhere behind your firewall because all your machines in an enterprise environment will be behind the firewall. There's only one port that is needed for communication, that is 443 on Azure DevOps endpoints, whatever those endpoints are, right? And even if your machine is hosted in some other cloud environment, it needs the same port to access the pipelines, right? So again, You can use self-hosted agents. Simple way to deploy, you can see some command references here, which will allow you to deploy that particular agent on a target machine, be it Windows, Linux, Mac OS, or any other OS. And then once you do that, you have to connect your agent to your Azure DevOps environment that you control, or probably the environment that you have compromised, right? Once you run that particular script that was available, this is how the output would look like. And once that is configured, this is how the screen would look like. So we have configured it on a simple Kali Linux box. And now in the agent pools, you can see that this machine is online, right? Which means now if you have privileges to modify pipelines, to execute malicious code on this machine, then you can control this machine from Azure DevOps environment, right? So simple way is we are running bash script on the machine, that is mkdir command, which is basically creating a folder on that target machine, right? And we can see that the agent job was executed, xyz commands were run, and at the end, finally, if we look at that particular folder, you'll see that the folder was created on the target machine, that is the Linux box. I also have a video, we can just show you a quick video. So if you look at this, sorry, I think it is not presented. So if you look at this, we are configuring the Azure pipelines to use a custom agent, right? So we'll go to project settings, we'll go to agent pool. We can see we have multiple agent. This is one of the agent which is added. We'll go to pipelines. Create a simple pipeline that would execute your bash scripts or any, depending on the environment. I'll create an empty job. Yep, that is the group that where our agent belongs to, default group. Go to bash, we add that particular task, and then in this particular bash script, we can add any command script or whatever you want and execute that on a target machine. Again, a good way to use this as a persistent mechanism. Right. Now the third topic that we are going to discuss is Microsoft Intune. I just explained that a few minutes back, right, when there were some questions. Can someone explain me this again? Right, endpoint. Exactly. So basically, it is a service which is designed by Microsoft to manage your endpoints, configurations on your endpoints, policies on your endpoints, and many other things on your endpoints, right? So it could allow you to integrate multiple devices, Windows, Linux, Mac, your iPhone, your Android-based devices, basically your mobile devices. So why this Intune is used usually in enterprises is to manage those devices. It should not leak data and multiple other things, right? So now, usually in enterprises, what happens is if you want to use Outlook on your phone, you have to use something known as company portal as an app, right? If you install that, your Intune policies would get configured, and that would push all the applications that are configured by Intune to be deployed as your corporate applications, and those applications would be considered as a work applications or work profile. Now you see it on your Android devices, usually that is known as work profiles, right? So that is how this Intune would be useful or helpful. In this, you can also configure that only selected brands of mobiles could be configured or integrated. You can configure the XYZ Android or iOS versions that could be used, right? If you are using an older version, company portal is not going to work. You cannot access Outlook. You cannot do any other works from your phone, right? So again, you have to forcefully update your device, be updated always, right? So it again depends on the enterprise how they configure their Intune policies and stuff, right? Again, in Intune, there are multiple things that are possible. One, there is script execution. So in Intune, there is something known as Intune script executions. We saw in the previous talk also there were certain scripts used for automation. Similarly, you can execute scripts on your Windows, Linux, and Mac OS devices, not on your mobile phones. Okay. So again, if you look at this particular screenshot here, you can see that we can add PowerShell scripts, right? You can define a script description, script settings, and everything. Now think of an attack path. You manage to compromise an Indian environment of a target enterprise, right, where you have privileges to configure scripts, which means if the enterprise environment is having, like, let's assume 1,000 employees, which means 1,000 devices are integrated and managed by Intune, single script execution on all 1,000 devices at a time, get a C2 communication of all 1,000 devices within one script or just by leveraging one script, right? So this can be one way of thinking of how useful this attack techniques could be if you have those level of privileges, right? So again, since there is an integration which allows you to configure Intune, this is the main reason you can actually compromise just devices. So now if you look at this particular attack path scenario, let's assume you have an attacker, you manage to compromise a privilege that is an Intune admin privileges, right? Which means now you have privileges to install malicious mobile applications. As I told you previously, ideally enterprise environments would push certain applications which are owned by them, or ideally standard applications like your basically your Teams, Outlook, and multiple other things, right? Maybe an AV, maybe an EDR agent that they would be used. What if you push an malicious mobile app? Now all those 100 iPhones, 100 Android devices, or 1,000 Android devices could be compromised just by those malicious apps, right? And depending on whatever the activities that you configure in your app, you can do all those on those devices. Second, scripts. We discuss you can run bash scripts or PowerShell based scripts on your machines. Third approach is there is something known as inline business applications that you can configure and install. So you can configure inline business applications to be installed on your Windows machine. It could be your MSI applications. It could be your there is something known as Win32 Intune apps, which is like a package that gets converted. So your source code is converted into an application format, which is a package file supported directly with Intune. You can use that and push those malicious applications on your Windows machines. And all those machines could have your maybe your C2 agents deployed across your environment. Right? Any questions so far? Look at the horizon of the attack. Just one service compromise, and you manage to compromise the entire enterprise. Because nowadays they are using those services. Anyone who is working in corporate using Teams, they would know this is like the primary service that is used by everyone. Any other questions so far? It can be Microsoft signed, it can be owned by you. Yes, depends. Yeah. If your package is good enough in terms of EDR, if your loader is not doing malicious activity, or if you manage to create a package which bypasses that specific EDR, then boom, you can, right? Any other questions? You can simply execute your script, right, and enumerate all the processes. Maybe note that one thing I forgot to mention is that scripts that you execute gets executed every 1 hour, right? So once you configure that, you trigger that execution, it would take 1 hour to execute that. There are ways to modify that, but for that you need access on that target machine to restart those services, or even if the machine is restarted, the scripts would get executed. Yes. Pre and post configurations. Yep. Pre-script or post-configuration commands can also be configured when you're using those inline business apps or inline app-based configurations. Yeah, it pulls from the Intune to execute whatever the commands or whatever the configurations that you have made on those machines. Yes, yes, possible. But again, it depends. If it is executed within whitelisted process as per ADR, then it will not be flagged. Like one of the example from again a real pen test, not a cloud pen test. Usually, what I've seen is a lot of companies or enterprises use WMA. Like there are tools or devices, there are services which allows you to manage devices in mask, not using in cloud environment, but an on-prem application. I'm not going to name the company or the application name. Maybe offline we can discuss that application. When I was working for one of the client, I saw that one of the application is used to manage updates, push updates. It is not SCCM. Okay, just to make it clear, and even configure the machines using WMA, which means now WMA is by default allowed on every machine because this particular application is using it. So EDR knows that this application, based on the behavior or based on whitelisting or whatever the configuration is, this application is allowed to execute WMA scripts on the target machine, which means now if we compromise the server which is managing that particular configuration, that instance, note that it could be like Intune, right? It is somewhat similar to Intune, but an on-prem version. You can deploy, configure, exploit, do whatever you want on entire environment. So if you sign that, right, you have something in iPhones, you need signed packages, signed IPA files, right? You also get developer certificates, which are used for testing purposes and thing, right? So if you are in developer or have a developer account, use that account to sign your package, get it pushed, right? How do developer test their applications? They need something, right? One of the simplest way. If that is, if it is a developer account, you have a developer certificate which allows you to test applications on devices. Yes. So there are multiple ways. Okay, you can also find out some certificates which are leaked somewhere in internet. Use that to sign your apps, and if those are allowed by Apple, your iOS devices, then boom. There are the horizon is very huge. It depends how you look at those specific things. So ideally, yes, root privilege is one thing, but secondly, your mobile devices do not support executions of PowerShell or Bash scripts at the moment, right? Again, if you're using ADB and all that, you get a shell access which allows you to do that, but on from Intune, you currently cannot do or manage that. Okay. Any other questions? No. Anyone who knows about application proxy? Ronak just gave a glimpse in his talk. Mm, somewhat, yeah, partially I can say. Any other? Exactly, right? So, do you guys know how zero trust environments work? Anyone who has used configured zero trust in their enterprise environments or use that? No clue. Can you give some glimpse? Yes. Right. You work in Zscaler. Okay, great. So yes, somewhat similar, like he told. Application proxy is a service which allows you to expose your on-prem services or any other services on cloud, right? Which means now you don't need to open any port on your firewall. It will be an outbound communication directly with your cloud environment. It could be a web application, it could be any other service running in your environment again, right? There are two or multiple ways by which you can configure application proxy. It is an agent which gets deployed. You can have a single server where your agent is configured, and from that server, your agent can communicate to like 100 other applications that are available, right? And you can configure this in that way as well, or have individual agents for individual application. Again, depends how you want to configure your environment. So if you look at and or no, so zero trust type of an environment, but not like an zero tier. It is a VPN service that you're talking. No, no, right? So what are the main components that application proxy has? It is like the endpoint, which is basically the target service that you want to expose on your cloud or from cloud. Second, your application proxy service. Third, application proxy connector. This is an agent which gets deployed on your on-prem or any other cloud environment from there that target service could be accessed. And the fourth part that you need your on-prem application, right? So if you look at this particular diagram, you can see that there is an end user which would try to connect on a specific domain, right? That specific domain request would be routed to application proxy server because that domain is ideally configured in Azure cloud environment or depending on that. Then you have some connectors. Those connectors could be installed in your DMZ zone or anywhere in your network. Okay, and those connectors would have access to all your applications, right? Now the best part is this connectors do not need an access from cloud to on-prem, which means in a normal traditional architecture, when an application is accessed, right, maybe a google.com that you access, that 443 service or port is enabled on those DMZ or the firewall, right? So that the traffic could come in. But in this case, it is completely opposite because the connectors keep on sending an outbound request and keep on pulling the data if there is any request that has to be served, right? So, which means you don't need to open any ports here. It is just an outbound connection from your connector to your application proxy server on 443. That's it, right? Which means the user is hitting a domain. The request is coming here and it is in probably in their database or whatever. Whenever this connector immediately tries to pull within fraction of seconds, it will see there is a request that has to be served. The request would be pulled by that specific connector. The connector will see, do I have that application configured in my environment? Can I serve those applications? If yes, what is that particular target server from where I need to fetch that particular request? It can be app 1, 2, 3 depending on the configuration, and once it fetch that specific request response from that server, it will send that response back to this, and this response will be forwarded to the user. Yes. So again, you're sending a request that is stored here, and your connector is continuously pulling that what is the request. It is pulling the data first and then as a response. So I'm sending a request from connector to this application proxy. I have to give a response. I send it. This is a request from a user. I get the first request. It is lying here. I'm sending another request from connector. Is there anything that I have to respond? It will say yes. You need to respond. Give a response on. It is happening on the same call, right? Yes. So I'm giving back my response stating that okay, this was the request that you asked from, and this is an. So I'm pulling that data. So when you send a curl command, right? Okay, I'll give you an example. Okay, when you do a curl to a google.com, you don't need to open 443 port on your machine, right? You are making a call, pulling the data, you got the data, sending back the response. That is how the communication happens. Exactly, exactly. Right. So if we go on this, here you can see that everything is connecting to this application proxy service, right? Only outbound connections. And on the same connections, the response would be served depending on the configurations that you have done, right? So again, if you as an attacker manage to compromise some of the enterprise applications which are used for application proxy, okay, then you can add your own users. If you own some users in that target tenant and get access to directly to those internal applications which are accessible over the internet, and use that. Again, once you get the access, and if you find some vulnerability in that application, it could be an RC, it could be any other vulnerability, right? If you find that, you compromise that specific application, which means now that application is hosted somewhere internal or some other cloud which is accessible only via application proxy. You manage to compromise, add your own users to that application group, right? Which means indeed your user got an access to that application. Now you can access the application, hunt for vulnerability, compromise the application, get your code executions. Just an example, whenever you configure an application proxy, an enterprise application is configured, and there is something known as users in group where you would define who all have the permissions, who all are the users who can access this particular application in your cloud environment. And this is how you gain access to that target applications which are hosted via application proxy.
So it's like whenever you hit the external URL, the user will be get back to the Microsoft login page. He will be checked if the user is added in this group or not. Only then he will be able to access the URL. If the application has further authentication, then yeah.
Right? So if you look at this particular attack path, let's assume you as an attacker compromise an application admin, right? And while enumerating, you found some enterprise applications which are actually used by the application proxy environment. You add your own users or group that you control to that particular application, and indeed you gain access to the application proxy. And now if you find any vulnerabilities, it could allow you to move laterally on the application server. It could be hosted anywhere. So now we are going to discuss about hybrid connections. Again, Ronak gave a touch base on this topic. Someone who would like to again give me idea what is hybrid connections?
Connecting in on-prem AD to Azure AD.
No. I hope it is fine. I'm taking too much time. No ideas? Okay, so basically what is hybrid connections? It is a service that is enabled or created by Microsoft which allows your cloud applications to interact with any other service. It can be hosted in any other cloud environments or on-prem, right? Let's assume you have some servers like maybe internal API server, right? Which is only used by your internal application, but there is an API that is created which your cloud application also wants to use it, right? It is not a VPN or something. It is a specific service which just allows you to do communication on target service. I'm just giving an example of specific kind of communication over HTTP or HTTPS protocol, depending on the protocol that you configure on the target port. Okay, I'll explain you so you will get a glimpse of how this service could be used. Okay, so what happens is, let's assume you have a service that is a database service that, or probably an API server which is only hosted on-prem, right, and accessible on-prem. It is useful for your all your on-prem applications. But now you have an application or an automation running in your cloud environment that needs to send some data or probably pull some data from that particular API, making an API call to that particular server or that particular service, right? This is where hybrid connections are useful. So your function apps, your app services could use hybrid connection. Indeed, your logic app could also use, because if you configure your logic apps as a standard logic app, in background it uses function apps for automations and other activities. So that is one thing. So basically, what it uses is there's something known as hybrid relays in Azure. Okay, so it creates a relay communication between your cloud application and your server that is hosted on-prem, where you install your this particular agent. So anyone who has heard about service bus in Azure? So can you just give some exactly? Exactly. So it is like a stateful communication that gives you an authentication or tells you that okay, yes, the message was consumed, received, and you're able to consume those requests and stuff, right? So in backend, actually, hybrid connection uses service bus and hybrid relays in backend, which means that now your cloud application, app services or function app could communicate directly with your any of your on-prem servers, right? It can be any service PS remoting, WMI, your HTTP service, your SQL service, any service that you can think of can be used for remote communication, can be used with your hybrid connections within function app. So if you look at this architecture diagram, you can see that your app service environment has an hybrid Azure relay that is configured. Again, in this case, your connector, which is installed on-prem or any other cloud environment, does an only an outbound call to Azure relay services, that is your service bus and stuff, and the app service also interacts with that target service only, right? So you don't need to open any ports on your on-prem systems, right? So how do you configure this or install this? Again, there is an agent signed and created by Microsoft named Hybrid Connection Manager, which has to be installed. And once you install that, you can configure your applications, your application service, app service, or function app to use that particular agent to perform specific activity. If you go on the next slide, if you look at this high level architecture, right? Something that was presented in a previous talk also, how we move from cloud to on-prem. This is a high level architecture of that. Let's assume an attacker compromises service principal, which has accesses on function app. It could be an access just to extract the published profile. It could be a full control. Again, completely depends on what access you have. Let's assume you have access to only published profile. You extract the credentials from there. You access the CUDO service, right? Since this function app is using hybrid connections, right? Credentials for accessing the machine. In this configuration or in this attack path, we are showing you or explaining you that this particular function app is interacting with machine 1 over PS remoting port. Anyone who knows what is PS remoting? PowerShell with accessing. So ideally, PS remoting WMI like services are used by manage your system admins or people who are managing those devices, right? To remotely run some commands, configure certain things, or manage your devices. So let's assume your function app, you enable PS remoting on your machine one, which your function app is accessing using your hybrid connection configuration, right? Credentials for accessing that machine, since you're accessing over PS remoting, you need admin credentials, or a user should have privileges to perform PS remoting on the target machine by adding that to a specific group, right? Once you have those privileges, your function app or an app service could access or execute PowerShell commands on machines, right? Which indeed, if the same credentials, same admin credentials are used, you can move laterally across the environment on-prem, right? Yes, depends. Yeah. So basically, in function app or app services, there is something known as publish profile. This publish profile has multiple credentials that are available. It could be credentials for your basic auth endpoint that we saw in the previous talk. It could be credentials for FTP services, right? Now, if you have privileges to download this published profile, indeed you get credentials for all those. And now, once you have credentials, you can backdoor the function app. You can access the code engine where you have access to your PowerShell or Bash console, depending on the environment that is used, right? You can see the source code, you can modify the source code, add a new function directly in the function app, which can do all those activities that you want to do. It completely depends. Hmm. Yes, in this case, a function app has been configured to use PS remoting to access this target machine using hybrid connection. No, it does an HTTP. Exactly. It is just like a tunnel, exactly, where your agent is just turning the traffic, whatever that is, will pass between them. Right. So this is one of the example where you can see that we have some source code in the function app, which is executing invoke commands on PSL routing port, that is 5986. So now in this diagram, you can see that first we are extracting the credentials from environment variable. Note that your function apps could have managed identities, right? And we saw in the previous diagram there was a key vault where the credentials are stored. Now I don't need to store clear text credentials in function app or anywhere else. I can use function app manage identity to use or extract the credentials from key vault directly, and my configuration can be made to extract those credentials in the environment variable. There is a specific configuration that you can make in your function app or app services to access the your keyword service directly using an URL. Okay. So now when we are using environment variables, we are directly getting the credentials. So now I am not showing you the hard coded credential, but I'm using the same logic. You can see first we managed to execute the command on the machine one. Okay. And then using the same approach, we nested the invoke command and executed this hostname command on the second machine, that was AAD connect machine. The first command was executed on this hybrid connection host name, that is basically your Windows 11 machine, which was configured. And now the second command that is getting executed is on AD connect from Windows 11 machine to AD connect. So this is like an approach that you can use to move laterally also on-prem or again depending on the configuration in any other cloud environment. Right? So as I told you, all these techniques that we've discussed can be used for persistence. Your Azure Arc, automation account, DevOps, hybrid connections, right? Which means you own or you have a new tenant that you control as an user, as an attacker, and you deploy any of this agent on the client environment and you manage to have persistence, and it can be ideally undetected for years and years and years because Microsoft URL, Microsoft binary, no one knows what is going in, no one monitors traffic for Microsoft domains. Anyone who does that, here, anyone from defense side, sorry, I'm speaking at Azure Microsoft Office and I'm right. So no one monitors Microsoft traffic because there are so many communications that are happening. If you start logging every traffic that is hitting Microsoft, still you can blend in easily because if any of these services is used by your target client, they are not going to monitor that. Boom. And all these services could be used for persistence. Right? Any questions first? Now we'll move on the second part.
Initially, you spoke about as a DevOps, it, I don't know the exact word, but it pulls it from the cloud every 1 hour, right? And if you want to change
That
that,
is intern scripts
yeah, yeah, yeah. And if you want to change that, you have to change it locally
on
on
the
the device.
machine, on
But
the
can
device.
you reverse it, like put a script to change it remotely on all the machines? I mean, just
Yes,
access
yes,
them.
you can. But first, that script would only get executed after an hour, right?
Yeah, 1 hour and then 10 minutes over.
Yeah, it depends. It depends. So I'm not sure if there is the talk is released. Probably DEFCON or Black Hat USA had a talk on how to use Intunes as a C2, right? Note that all the services that were discussed could be used or leveraged as your C2 redirectors or your implants could communicate there, and then you can leverage that. Depends how you configure it. Okay. Service bus based C2 is already there. Yokobo Strike base. If you don't know, there is a guy known as Langvik who has a repo or probably a project created 2 or 3 years back using service bus. So all of this could be used as a C2s.
When we are creating different talent, like I created my own talent, I'm giving him permission. Aren't new permissions being given or taken?
You control your tenant. Who is going to monitor it? You are the boss of your tenant, right?
What about on the? I'm not sure how it works. Like, let me know. If I'm taking a PC and attaching it to my own tenant, shouldn't it trigger some kind of a alert or something?
I'm just making a communication that is HTTP calls on those target endpoints. You don't, if you're monitoring the request, data going in that particular request, which is again encrypted, if you're decrypting all those requests and extracting the data and trying to monitor that, probably yes. But if you're doing that, then you should have a probably a server with 1000 TBs or like XYZ exabyte, because every day all your machines are going to communicate every few seconds to all these Microsoft services. So now we will move on the second part, that is how to pivot from on-prem to cloud. We discussed about how you pivot from cloud to on-prem. Now we'll discuss about how we pivot from on-prem to cloud, right? So sorry. So there is something known as hybrid identities. Again, Ronak gave a touch base on hybrid identities, how we use that in one of our pen test abused app. I'm going to give you details of how actually each of these hybrid identities could be abused in general. Okay, in current world, all of the enterprises environment would be using hybrid identities somewhere or the others. If you're on-prem active directory, if you have an environment where you have on-prem active directory, your on-prem active directory credentials would usually be synced with your enter id, because no one wants to remember two different ids, two different credentials for accessing same enterprise environment, right? Everyone wants something like single sign-on. Once you log in on your Windows machine, you don't need to authenticate on any other applications that your enterprise owns, right? So this is becoming very common across multiple enterprises. How hybrid integrations or hybrid identities work in Azure environment, we'll discuss them, and then we'll look at the attack paths. So if you look at this high level diagram, note that this diagram is an old diagram, again still present on Microsoft website, but Azure Active Directory is now renamed to Entra ID. Okay, but the diagrams are not updated. So now you can see that Azure Active Directory could be integrated with any application. It could be your Microsoft applications like O365, Power Apps, or any other application. It could be non-Microsoft applications, Dropbox, Salesforce, or any other application. It could be your on-prem applications. Like one of the example we saw, application proxy-based authentications and stuff could also be integrated with this. It could be on-prem identities, which is basically you sync your users with Entra ID, so that same user is used to access all the services. It could be synced with your maybe Oracle or SAP-based applications that you have on-prem or cloud environment. Your cloud HR portals nowadays, a lot of cloud or SaaS-based applications are used to manage your activities, timesheet, your holidays, and every other things, right? And the external identities. When I mean external identities, Enter ID also supports you to authenticate with your Gmail, Facebook, GitHub IDs, right? Which means you can use any of these external identities to authenticate to Enter ID and gain access to any of this application. Again, depends on the client environment, right? Federated identity is different. Yes, that is what. Yes, that is true. So, Federation Service of Active Directory was doing this earlier, right? But now Microsoft recommends that you should move from Federation to Entra ID directly using the native approach to integrate everything. Yes, because again, you need to manage the entire Federation server, your web proxy, Federation web proxy, the Federation proxy server actual, and then your Active Directory, right? So there is a linking that you have to do. All your request comes to your initial web proxy server or your DMZ server, which is hosting your login page and stuff. That is then routed to Active Directory, right? But now using Enter ID and all this configuration, you can easily bypass or avoid the uses of Federation services, because again, management is a task. There are multiple attacks that are also possible, right? Again, you can integrate Enter ID using Federation services also, but we are not going to discuss them here. Federation or yeah, everything. It depends. Or SAML, any modern authentication mechanisms could be integrated, right? So again, there are three options that could allow you to integrate your on-prem identities with Entra ID. First is password hash synchronization (PHS). Second is pass-through authentication, and third is Active Directory Federation service. Right? This is supported, but again, Microsoft is like avoid using this and just use one of them. right? Again, Microsoft is enforcing on using PHS. Anyone from Microsoft identity team? Okay, so we'll first discuss about how PHS works. Okay, so let's assume you have your users, your devices, your on-prem servers, and your cloud environment, right? How PHS would work is all your identities, or depending on the configurations, selected identities, all those credentials for those identities would be synced with your Entra ID, or the older name Azure Active Directory, which means any application that is integrated with Entra ID, you can use the same credentials to access any of this application which are integrated. And same credentials could also be used to access any of the on-prem applications devices that you have, because it is directly integrated with your Active Directory. Right? So password hash synchronization is a functionality which syncs your hash, user account hash, which is present in your Active Directory, to Entra ID. Again, there is an encryption that is done on top of NTLM hash, and then it has been synced to Azure Active Directory. Okay, so again, synchronize users from on-prem. Yeah, there would be two identities, but when you look at Azure Cloud environment, if it is a sync identity, there will be attributes that is mapping or stating that it is a sync identity with your on-prem set and every other information that is present on your on-prem Active Directory attributes. Okay, so again, all your synchronized users, or you can configure your Entra ID to sync specific users, maybe 10, 100, or specific OUs to your Entra ID. Whenever you configure PHS, I have already given a glimpse. There are two user accounts that are configured, MSOL account and a sync account. I hope I don't have to repeat this, right? Okay. By default, the sync of hashes happen every 2 minutes, which means once you update your password on-prem on an on-prem Active Directory, within 2 minutes, the same new password could be used on your cloud applications or environments. DC sync, yes, that is what this MSOL account does. It syncs all the credentials, extract the credentials from your domain controller. Yes, if you have access to this user account, you can do that. And now, since you have an access to this user account, obviously you have an access to that AD Connect machine. Using the same machine, same credential, if you sync, even the alerts that are triggered by tools like MDI would get bypassed here, because this account is usually whitelisted. The machine is also whitelisted because that is doing that specific activity, routing your access. So best account to do DCSing attack and remain silent, right? So again, just to give you more glimpse of how you can extract those credentials, right? I have discussed that, but just to give you a glimpse, these credentials are stored. You can extract the credentials in clear text. Credentials are stored in MS SQL instance. It could be hosted on the same server, or it could be hosted on remote server also, again depending on the configuration that are done. But even if it is hosted on a remote server, this AD Connect machine would directly have access to that SQL target server, because it has to interact with that server, right, to validate your credentials, perform action, and everything, right? So if you have admin privileges on the AD Connect server, indeed you can gain access to that SQL server. And those credentials are actually encrypted using DP API. Anyone who knows the DP API stuff? DP API. So basically, data protection layer that Windows has, which can use machine keys and stuff for encrypting your data that is present on the device. Okay. So anyone with system access or high privilege access on a machine could extract those keys and perform decryption operations on that uh, content. So to decrypt the credentials, any of the tools that you use or look at, there are two things that the tools or scripts would be doing. First, they would be impersonating a specific token, that is WinLogon and MII server base. There are two processes, WinLogon and MII server. This is basically an identity server, a service that is running whenever you install AD Connect on a machine. It would impersonate a token, use that token to authenticate to the SQL server. And since these processes have highest privileges like NT authority, those processes would be allowed to extract the DP API keys and perform the decryption operation. So now again, if you look at this, SyncStar has a privilege to reset the credentials of any sync user, which is this account is created on cloud, right? Second, it also has privileges to add credentials to service principal. Anyone who remembers what is service principal? No. App registrations or enterprise applications are basically service principals, right? So even if you compromise sync account, and if you find there's some service principal with high privilege API permissions, you can add credentials to that particular application, impersonate that app, access or leverage the permissions that app has, right? So even if your sync user do not have high privileges like global admin, you can still use this technique if you find any service principal to escalate your privileges to global admin, right? No, no, no. That is separate stuff.
I have a question related to that. I'm not familiar with Azure. I think it's same as Active Directory service principal name
No,
which I'm looking
no,
for.
no. It is entirely different. Maybe it is a so app registration and enterprise app could be a extensive topic to be covered because there are multiple things that are involved. So app registration is like an object that gets created in your home tenant, which means wherever you're creating that specific application. And at the same time, there is also an enterprise application object that is created with the same name on the same tenant. But when you register an application using app registration, and if you select an option multi-tenant application, what happens is that application could be used in any other tenant, which means I as a user could send you an authentication link to any of you guys, right? And now if you own any specific tenant, you can authenticate. It will give you a consent prompt. You accept that, and an enterprise application object will get created in your tenant also. The only reference between the home tenant and the target tenant would be your application ID. There's no other reference. You cannot map where this application is or which is the actual home tenant where the application is registered. Ideally, you don't have any details. Maybe Microsoft has that, but you don't have that. Okay. I'm not sure if you guys have read about uh, 6 months back or somewhere. There was a very good hack that happened in Microsoft. Sorry, anyone if you are from Microsoft, right? Someone managed to compromise Microsoft tenant and gain access to multiple things, right? That was by abusing service principles. They had a test tenant where one of the user account was compromised by a brute force attack, and that test tenant application had been given a consent on your production tenant. They managed to compromise the test tenant application, got an access or authenticated using the same app on the production tenant, and they compromised the exchange. Ideally, exchange was compromised. So again, if you have high privileges, if you have a user account with high privileges, you can reset the credentials, sync user account, and escalate your privileges. Now, we have discussed there are two ways by using PHS. One was Enter ID Connect, and then Enter ID Connect Sync, and the second approach is using Enter ID Cloud Sync. Okay. Now, when you actually configure Enter ID Cloud Sync, the entire approach is different. Okay. There are user accounts that are created, but now you don't have credentials stored anywhere. Even I'm not sure if this user account credentials are stored somewhere, but at the moment there is no research out or we could not find anything that could allow us to get the clear text credentials of this account at the moment. So what is the difference? First, we saw that there was an MSOL account that was created, but now in this case, there is a GMSA account that gets created with a name by default name of Pro Agent MSA. Anyone who knows GMSA? Group Managed Service Account. A replacement for service principal based service accounts that were present earlier, right? So Microsoft created a new type of account that is GMSA account, which are ideally useful if you want to configure your service to use any service account. Okay. The best part of using GMSA is, again, not on the slide, just out of my knowledge, is the credentials are not stored anywhere. Whenever a GMSA account is used by the target service, the credentials are actively fetched from the Active Directory. Credentials are actually generated by your Active Directory and given back in an encrypted form. As an attacker, you can only get the GMSA NTLM hash. You cannot ever get the clear text credentials because it is again I think 256 byte long credentials. So there are ways by you can attack GMSA accounts, but there is a limitation to that. Again, same privileges are there, which means if you manage to have access to this account, you can perform a DCC. I'll show you a screenshot that we did on a real pen test recently, few months back. Then we have second, that is now the account name is AD to AAD sync service account, which is again having the same privileges that we saw in the sync account. But this time the credentials are not stored in the target machine. There is a way by which you can compromise this specific account as well by extracting the access token. But there is a long process because you first need to extract the certificate that is configured on the machine, which means you already need to have admin privileges to extract the certificate, use that certificate with your work proxy and stuff to monitor all the requests that are flowing from your connect machine, Entra ID cloud sync machine to the cloud, extract the access token, and then use the access token to leverage this particular privileges. So if you look at this particular screenshot, this is from one of the live vendors last month I did. We found a user account which had read GMSA password privileges on this GMSA account. And this was the GMSA account which was used to configure Cloud Sync, which means now we have privileges to perform DCC and we managed to escalate internally, which indeed we use that domain admin credentials to reset another user credentials, which was a sync account on a cloud and a high privilege in a cloud, that is global admin. Yeah, that was a screenshot. So again, if a sync user account have high privileges, we can reset the credentials of those accounts in the domain, that is your on-prem domain environment, and it would get synced again in the cloud, which means you can escalate your privileges from on-prem to your cloud environment with global admin. This is something that we did last month. Then the second authentication, I hope there is a time, right? I'm going slow. No issues with the time, right? The second approach is pass-through authentication, that is PTA. Okay, anyone who knows what is pass-through authentication? No idea. So in the previous method, we saw that the credentials were sent to the cloud environment by adding an additional layer of encryption and stuff, right? Which means credentials are also present on Active Directory. Credentials are also present in Azure environment. Now with PTA, the things are changed. Now Entra ID do not have any credentials. They just have the connection that is added to your PTA agent, which means if I have to explain this diagram, let's assume this is your user, this is your cloud environment, Active Directory server, and this is the agent PTA a machine where PTA agent is configured. Whenever a user tries to authenticate on any of the cloud application which is connected with your Entra ID, right? Entra ID will see that okay, this user is trying to authenticate. It would forward that request to your PTA agent. The credentials and everything are forwarded to your PT agent. Your PT agent would forward that credentials to Active Directory to validate if those credentials are true, valid, yes or no. Once the PT agent receives the output stating that yes, the credentials are valid, user is valid, the request or the access would be granted to that application. Again, depending if that particular user has an access to that cloud application. So in this case, the credentials are not synced on cloud, but this is the server which does all your activity. Anyone who can think of what all things are possible here? What if I tell you compromise the server? Because you don't want to store the credentials or have two copies of your credentials. On-prem ID, yes. Someone from Microsoft can answer that. Okay, I'll give you some pointers here. Okay, so PDA has ideally the password is not synced with Entra ID. Second part is all the credentials are sent to their on-prem AD, right? Actually, those credentials are in encrypted form, but on your on-prem AD, if you manage to compromise that PTA agent, you can backdoor that particular PTA agent. Okay, one more thing just to highlight was It allows the organization to enforce on-prem Active Directory password policy. The only one benefit, same password policy across every environment. One more thing I can add is when you configure PHS, right? It is the funniest thing to happen. If your password is expired on-prem, that password will still work on cloud application because password policies could be different. And by default, Enter ID do not have something that is configured to expire your password, which means you cannot access your on-prem application or server because the password is expired. You need to change that. But same password could be used to access any of your cloud application because password is not in PHS. But in PTA, the only benefit is password policy is also sync, which means same policy that is applied on Active Directory is applied on your cloud environment because
Someone compromises the on-prem area. You can be able to access all stuff.
that is obvious given, right? So what we can do is we can still backdoor the PTA agent, which means if you backdoor that PTA agent, there is a technique where you can embed your malicious DLL, which your PTA agent would use at a runtime, right? Which means there are two things. Anyone who has heard about skeleton key and Active Directory, right? Anyone who can give me what is that skeleton key based attack? What it does? Yeah, you said yes. Anyone? Right? So skeleton key based attack in an Active Directory environment is a way where you can hardcode a password to all the users, which means if you manage to compromise your domain controller, you can modify your LSS process stating that any user who tries to authenticate can use his actual credentials or a credential which is an hard-coded credential, which means I can, if I compromise domain controller, okay, I backdoor that with skeleton key based malware. Okay, not talking about this attack now. I backdoor that with skeleton key based exploit where I hard-coded a password. It can be like example admin at the rate 123. You as a user have your user account. It can be any user in the domain account can use their own password, or as an attacker, since I know the actual password which I have embedded in the LSS process memory, that password is also valid for any of these domain user accounts. Anyone who knows how frequent the Active Directory is rebooted? How frequent the Active Directory is rebooted? Right? Usually after years and years and years. So the skeleton key based attack, the best part is yes, it will still leave your memory, LSS memory till the time your Active Directory is not rebooted. Similar type of attack works in your PTA, right? Once you compromise your AD Connect machine where your PTA agent is configured, you deploy this type of backdoor. There could be two types of backdoor that you could deploy. One, you could deploy backdoor to write your credentials to a log file, which means any user who is authenticating on the cloud application, those user credentials are stored in a log file in a clear text because in backend PT agent uses something known as uh, log on with process or user token or something. There is a Win API call. I forgot exact Win API call. That Win API call actually uses the actual password, and you can make your DLL code your DLL in a way which could log that particular Win API call by adding an hook and log that to a file. Second option, as I told you, you can do somewhat similar like skeleton key malware. You backdoor your DLL stating that any user who is authenticating, if the credentials are XYZ, whatever he passed, fine. Otherwise, the user credentials can be this. If this is the credential, I can still allow him to authenticate, which means you can access every cloud application with any user in that tenant. It could be global admin, it could be anyone, right? Because now you have two credentials for one user, one credential that you know you control, and the second credential that the user has. How frequent this server will be rebooted? Again, maybe in years and years whenever there is a maintenance. Then single sign-on. Anyone who will give us a brief about what is single sign-on?
Log into your one ID,
Yeah.
and that ID gives the
every other application can be used, right? But now, when you use single sign-on, every other identity, every other application also has to validate that you're correct, right? Which means there is some way of configuration, some configuration that is done on your on-prem or your cloud application, which validates those things. If it is Windows, usually any known protocol that you guys know, single sign-on for single sign-on. No, famous protocol that is used for Windows authentication or related to Windows. Exactly, right? Kerberos is your world for Windows authentication. So that is how single sign-on work in on-prem environment, right? You authenticate to your machine. If there are any file shares, you access that file share directly without entering the credentials. If you have privileges, Kerberos authentication would give you access to those file shares. Somewhat similar you can do with Azure cloud environment. Thanks. Those slides. So what is single sign-on? Again, it allows you the user authentication to be accessed or allow you to access all your cloud application, on-prem applications with a single credential. When it comes to configuring SSO and Entra ID, you can ideally you need some prerequisites. First, your Microsoft device should be Microsoft Entra ID joined, which means because if it is not joined to your Entra ID, how would you do your single sign-on with your Entra ID based application? Second, you should have hybrid identity configured. It could be using any of these connectors, Microsoft Entra ID Connect or Cloud Sync. Okay. And third, you should enable SSO. And again, it can depend how you enable SSO on your on-prem applications and your cloud applications. But your application or the agent should have access to your DC to make sure that SSO is working, right? So now what happens is when you enable SSO with Indra ID, there is a machine account that get created that is Azure AD SSO ACC dollar. Dollar is ideally representation of a machine account. Okay, so there is a machine account that is created. There are multiple service principals that are added to that particular machine account to support the Kerberos authentication part. Again, you cannot do Kerberos attack on this machine account because again it is a machine account. Password is auto managed. It is a 128 characters password which is difficult to crack. By default, you can have a configuration where the credentials would be rotated every 30 days. But usually, again, in an enterprise environment, credentials are not rotated for that particular account for years and years. Whatever I have seen, at least for 2 years, I have seen those are not rotated, right? So now the computer account Kerberos decryption key is shared securely with Microsoft Entra ID because your on-prem server, when you try to authenticate on your cloud application, there has to be a valid authentication that happens. So someone has to sign that particular key, right? So that your Entra ID can validate if that key is correct, the authentication of the signed package is correct, and give you the access to your target application, right? If you know Active Directory based Kerberos attack, the main account that is used for signing your Kerberos ticket is KRBTT, right? So once you compromise that, you ideally own the entire environment. Somewhat similar, once you compromise this user account, this machine account, you can ideally gain access to any sync account that is present in Entra ID Cloud. Which means, Ronak, can you go on the next slide? Right? If you look at this particular diagram, this is a workflow how it works. So if I have to go from one, user tries to access this application, right? First application request is forwarded. That request is then redirected to your authentication page where the user will first initiate the authentication, right? User enters the username, your machine or whatever would send an Kerberos challenge, Kerberos ticket to the cloud environment once everything is done, right? Then your fifth request will be request to your Active Directory environment for your Kerberos ticket to validate and everything. Once the credentials and everything are validated, you will get an Kerberos ticket, which would indeed be presented to your cloud Entra ID, right? So that now this Kerberos ticket is valid, and this ticket would have some data which Entra ID could understand, decrypt, and authenticate that target user to access that app, right? Now the Kerberos Azure AD decrypts the Kerberos ticket because now they both share a same key to encrypt and decrypt, like that is Azure AD SSO account. right? And then once this process is completed, Kerberos ticket is validated. Azure will allow that particular user to get sign in and access, will allow the access to that application. Now, this is a case where you're directly signing to that Microsoft portal. What if your SSL is enabled on your device as well? So you don't need to sign in here. You have already done Windows logon, right? All this process is integrated with that. You don't need to authenticate, but somewhat similar process would happen in the background to generate that Kerberos ticket and validate that ticket on Enter ID. Yes, somewhat. Ideally, you can name it as silver ticket. So now, how do you abuse this? Once you have access to this particular account, you can leverage the NTLM hash of this account. Okay, you can request an NTLM hash of any of the sync account of Azure, which means using this account, you have an access to any Azure account, any sync account in the Azure environment. You generate a ticket, sign that ticket with this particular account, use the ticket to authenticate on the target service, you gain the access. Just again from one of our real pen tests, if you look at this, I requested an Kerberos ticket with this SID and this SID for this particular target user account. So I wanted a Kerberos ticket for this target user account, and this hash is for ADSSO, Azure AD SSO account, right? Once I have this, I have the Kerberos ticket. I use the Kerberos ticket to request an access token. I get an access token, and now I can access any of the services. One more abuse to move from on-prem to cloud environment. So that's all. Further research that can be done majorly on moving from cloud to on-prem. You can also use Logic app. We are doing some research, but it will take some time to be published because we are just packed with multiple talks and stuff traveling. There are multiple things that you can also do with Azure Arc for databases and K8s, right? If you know how to compromise Kubernetes instance and use Azure Arc, it has a again huge horizon to compromise your Kubernetes cluster and stuff. You have something known as Azure Data Factory, which you can explore. Again, it has potentials of using custom agents and stuff, and many other services that are available in Entra ID or Azure ideally. Any questions? That's it for the talk. Any questions? Any doubts?
THS is has been. So
It-
when we have
okay.
to recommend it to a company, what we should recommend to a
PHS is something that you should recommend, but your Connect server, that is Enter ID Connect or CloudSync server, has to be in a tier 0. So I'm not sure if you guys know how what is the tiering approach in an Active Directory environment. If you know that, then if it has to be in the tier 0, which is with very limited access. You need to kill all the attack paths to get to that AD Connect machine. Once that machine is compromised, the cloud is gone. Most probably. And even follow best practices. Do not allow or grant high privileges to your sync accounts on cloud. Global admin accounts should always be cloud only accounts, which means only on Entra ID, not on your on-prem. There's also an attack technique that could allow you to abuse hybrid identities, but again, uh, I'll not say it is unexplored, but there is a way by which you can pivot from cloud to on-prem also, because now Entra ID has initiated or released a feature which allows you to sync your cloud identities to your on-prem, which means if there is a configuration misconfigured, you can sync the account that you own in your cloud to on-prem, maybe a domain admin.
So, like, in the beginning, there was during the installation of the Azure Arc agent, right? So, the installation command, and only what can you do? You know, like, why are you installing something, installing own tenant or something like that?
You can configure it on your own. So which means now example there is an agent, right? You want to deploy a persistent on a machine, right? You install that agent, configure that to talk to your own tenant or tenant that you control, right? No. So can you go on that one slide? I'll just yeah, okay. So now if you look at like in this, if you look at this run connect command part, here you'll see that I'm trying to connect to a specific resource group, specific tenant, specific subscription, and my cloud. This variable actually has some tokens and stuff, right? And this correlation ID which is not needed. When you automate this with a normal azcm agent command, you also need to pass access token. This connect is directly actually using the credentials that are passed here, right? Authentication type is set to token, right? That is the reason. You can pass your access token here, and that access token will allow them to authenticate to your tenant, which means now this agent is connected to your tenant, and you can manage that from your tenant. Exactly. So while configuring the connection, you configure it to your own tenant. Any other questions? Yes, there are ways. If I'm not wrong, yes. Any other questions? No doubts? Bouncer?